For many hundreds of years, Chinese intellectuals were unable to find a spiritual home. Some were lifelong loyalists to the monarchy, others drifted with the historical tide. At the same time, they yearned for a life of tranquility in nature. And to those scholars who explored the world, Lushan was like a faithful friend waiting for them. The mountain, having stood for thousands of years, was a solace in their solitude. Beiping, autumn 1937. For months, the city had lain silent. The only sounds were the shouted orders and martial songs of the Japanese invaders. In one courtyard house, the owner harboured a longing. It was to live in seclusion, and it was a desire he expressed in writing. Standing by the railing, I feel the storm of the day, but to China, I am no more than an onlooker. But with the coming of the Japanese, he was forced to abandon his dream, and ultimately, his life would end in tragedy. The man was Chen Sanli. He was a leading poet whose work had been praised by the great Indian writer Rabindranath Tagore. Through his friend and fellow poet Zhang Xiaoxu, Chen Sanli had been approached by the Japanese with a request to accept a post in their puppet government. Instead of accepting, Chen Sanli reproached Zhang Xiaoxu as a traitor to his country. He formally ended their friendship, which had lasted for 50 years, and declared he would stop taking both food and medicine. And so, 5 days passed. As his life ebbed away, his thoughts turned to the 5 years he had spent on Mount Lu, in a house known as Pine Forest Villa. At a time of personal tragedy, his memories of the flowers and grass of Lushan brought the poet great solace. He had left the mountain at the outbreak of the war against the Japanese, and he had never been back. And so, in the autumn of 1937, the patriotic poet Chen Sanli passed away in his home in Beiping. At the end of the year, his third son, Chen Yinchue, left Beiping and headed to the south of China. The following year, Zhang Xiaoxu died in mysterious circumstances in Changchuan, and the rumor was that he'd been murdered by the Japanese. By April 1945, victory over the Japanese was in sight. Chen Yinchue, by now living in Chengdu, wrote a poem in memory of my former home. It read, "Victory approaches my country torn asunder. My aged and ailing self comes to its remainder. When can I dream of the trees and flowers at the pine gate? Now I have to make wherever I am my home." The country was shattered, and he could not return home. Mount Lu, that he, like his father before him, had long dreamed of, seemed an impossible distance away. Chen Sanli and his son Chen Yinchue were natives of Xiushui in Jiangxi province, but for a time they lived on Mount Lu. Although their stay was brief, like other scholars in the centuries before them, the mountain remained etched on their hearts for their whole lives. For many hundreds of years, Chinese intellectuals were unable to find a spiritual home. Some were lifelong loyalists to the monarchy, others drifted with the historical tide. But it was these men who upheld the ideal of self-cultivation and working for the benefit of the state. At the same time, they yearned for a life of tranquility in nature.
中国古人讲学而优则仕，就是你读好了书要去入仕做官。所以做官本身，我想不要把它理解得太负面，它实际上也是一种为公众服务，也是一种担当。但是要做官的话呢，不见得任何时候都有时机，所以中国儒家又发展出另外一套准则，就是孔子讲的用之则行，舍之则长。
中国的文人一直都是自然之子，离去了整个自然的陶冶，深锁在书房之中的人是没有办法建立他的天地格局的。大家看看，古往今来成就大事的人，一定是在这个世界的行走之中获得了他的襟怀跟他的胆识。
And to those scholars who explored the world, LUSHAN was like a faithful friend waiting for them. The mountain, having stood for thousands of years, was a solace in their solitude. Together, the great people and the great mountain created many legends in Chinese cultural history. In the year 383 AD, the Prime Minister of the Eastern Jin, Xie, was informed that an Eastern Jin force 80,000 strong had defeated an army of the former Qing dynasty that was 10 times stronger. Thanks to this Eastern Jin victory, the culture of the Central Plains of China could continue to flourish. In passing down its culture to later generations, LUSHAN, with its associations with Confucianism, Buddhism and Taoism, played a vital role. One day in the year 411, a man wearing wooden sandals climbed Mount Lu. His name was Xie Lingyuan, and he was a grandson of the Eastern Jin Prime Minister. But unlike his father, he wasn't interested in a career in government. As he wandered among the high peaks, Xie Lingyuan chanted sun and moon, shaded day and night, frost and snow, seen in summer and winter. He wrote poetry and painted pictures celebrating the mountain and the valleys in it.
它的出现意味着就是山水诗作为一个独立的诗歌品种开始确立了。因为他创作的作品多，另外他的质量高，另外在他的诗歌里面呢，山水美作为一种客观的一种这个自然美的一种这个表现对象吧，也更加明确。
As he walked among the mountains and rivers of LUSHAN, Xie Lingyuan almost by chance created an important school of poetry. It would become known as natural landscape poetry.
那些李白的诗啊，还有这个苏轼的诗啊，如果把他们诗歌里面这山水的因素都去掉的话，那就很难想象中国这个诗歌是应该会是什么样子。说这个话的意思，其实就是说山水跟中国古典诗歌之间的关系啊，极其的密切。
In all, Xie Lingyuan wrote 11 poems about LUSHAN, and he made Jiangxi province the home of Chinese natural landscape poetry. LUSHAN in Jiangxi became a powerful magnet and an inspiration for countless generations of poets. For many hundreds of years, Chinese intellectuals were unable to find a spiritual home. Some were lifelong loyalists to the monarchy, others drifted with the historical tide. At the same time, they yearned for a life of tranquility in nature. And to those scholars who explored the world, Lushan was like a faithful friend waiting for them. The mountain, having stood for thousands of years, was a solace in their solitude. In 2007, the LUSHAN National Park brought together a team of researchers to compile the anthology of poems on Lushan. The idea was to bring all the poems ever written about Lushan together in a single collection. The more the researchers sorted through the old documents, the more clearly did a famous figure emerge.
从晋朝之前一直到民国，古人写庐山的诗歌，我们现在能找到的有名有姓的是16000多首。
占全球已知白鹤总数的95%以上。
The famous figure who emerged from the mountain of documents was a drunk and a singer. His hair was dishevelled, and he roamed the rivers in his boat. From the age of 25 until he was 57, he climbed Mount Lu 5 times. The Taiwan scholar Yu Guangzhong has described the poet thus: as the brandy pours down his throat, 7/10 becomes the moonlight, and the rest the glint of a sword. With a single breath, he gave life to half of High Tang Dynasty culture. For all this, he is known as Shi, the immortal poet.
大家知道我国唐代有一位伟大的诗人叫李白吗？知道。他曾经写过一首关于庐山的诗，你们知道是什么吗？望庐山瀑布，日照香炉生紫烟，遥看瀑布挂前川，飞流直下3000尺，疑是银河落九天。
The poet was Li Bai, and thanks to his great poem, the waterfall on Xiaofeng Peak attracts tourists in their droves still today. Here, visitors can stop and imagine the moment when the immortal poet first set eyes on the waterfall.
香炉峰上飘出的那个雾霭，恍若天上的祥云，所以瀑布似乎就是从天上那个祥云中流露下来的。是这样的一种把现实和隐含着的人文，加上他自己非常奇妙的想象结合在一起，所以它可以超越现实所见的这个事物，而进入到一个更高的，让我们的思绪，让我们的情感可以飞扬、可以激越的一个新的境界。
The poet's encounter with Lushan was but a momentary one, but at that moment, a literary miracle was created. In just 4 lines, High Tang Dynasty art was exhibited in all its glory.
我们今天所有同盟开悟的时候，这首诗都会朗朗上口。它给你一种中国人奇幻的审美。 它给你一种诗意的思维，它让你能够看到9天之水，长河泄露变为庐山的瀑布。这是什么？太早的时候遇到这样的风景，它就随着你青春历练、生命成长，成为这一生自然的滋养。
现在一首诗跟着一个瀑布走了2000多年，还要走向凡有华人所在之地，这种的文化现象吧。 那是不可以再复制的。
Although many people know of the poem and its connection with Lushan, few of them realize that Lushan is associated with a turning point in Li Bai's misfortune-ridden life. Li Bai embraced the Confucian principle of involvement in state affairs, but he also admired the Taoist principle of remaining in seclusion. Yet, he lived as an itinerant. Li Bai's life was a complex interweaving of all these different threads. In the year 725, the 25-year-old poet left his home in Sichuan carrying his sword with him. He set out with the dream that his journey would somehow benefit the people of the world. When he reached Lushan, he was spellbound by the beautiful scenery, and thereupon the idea came to him that after a successful career in government, he would retire and spend his remaining years on the mountain. In the year 745, at the age of 45, Li Bai visited Jinling and saw the mountain again. He came across a place called Pingfengdia, and there and then he swore to abandon his official career. In 750, Li Bai came to Lushan with his fourth wife, the beautiful Lady Zong. One morning, 1200 years ago, as the poet gazed at 5 peaks on Mount Lu, he wrote the lines, "On the southeast of Lushan, the 5 old men peaks stand high, like golden lotuses against the azure sky." And so Li Bai made Lushan his home, both physically and spiritually. For many hundreds of years, Chinese intellectuals were unable to find a spiritual home. Some were lifelong loyalists to the monarchy, others drifted with the historical tide. At the same time, they yearned for a life of tranquility in nature. And to those scholars who explored the world, Lushan was like a faithful friend waiting for them. The mountain, having stood for thousands of years, was a solace in their solitude. In the year 755, the warlord An Lushan led a revolt against the Tang dynasty government. The following year, the rebels took the capital and established the Great Yan regime. At the time when the rebellion was taking place, Li Bai and his fourth wife were visiting Mount Lu. The poet, as he gazed at the pines, rocks and clear streams, made up his mind to settle there. He had a hut built and wrote, "I am not a man who can save the world, so let me live in seclusion at Pingfengdia." It seemed that with his 60th year approaching, he had found enlightenment. However, just a few months later, an envoy arrived at Lushan. He had been sent by Li Lin, Prince Yong, the military commander of the southeast. The prince wished the poet to become his aide. Li Bai gladly accepted. However, the decision would prove to be a grave mistake. Soon after Li Bai's appointment to his army, the prince became embroiled in a power struggle. Prince Yong was defeated, and Li Bai was convicted of rebellion. Li Bai was sentenced to exile, but he was pardoned by the emperor. On his way home, he wrote the famous poem, setting off from Baidi city in the morning. Having escaped certain death, the delighted poet climbed Mount Lu again as he passed by Jiujiang. This time, Li Bai's mood as he viewed the mountain was more somber, coloured by the setbacks he had experienced. His poem, Song of Lushan for Lu Shuzhou, describes many of the scenic spots we know today. I climb high and cast my eyes on everything between heaven and earth. I see a great river run away beyond return. Yellow clouds rolling thousands of miles stir up the wind, and 9 white streams flow around a snow-capped peak.
李白的诗歌风格是高朗的，气象是博大的。 所以李白有一个绰号叫谪仙，是天上的神仙，但是被放到了人间。这样的人物是无法用现实的各种东西来牢笼住的。
However, Li Bai was unable to give up his political aspirations. Not long after returning to his home in Nanchang, the poet, now 62 years old, joined the imperial army, putting down another rebellion. The following year, as he returned home, he died. Li Bai had failed to fulfill his political ambitions, but his temperament, unrestrained, vigorous and sweeping, had never been subdued by the setbacks he had suffered in life. Fate, by toying with Li Bai, contrived to make him one of the greatest figures in Chinese literary history.
李白这一生去过5次庐山，他对庐山的那种心存向往，让他成就了他真正伟大的企图。
With the passing of Li Bai, High Tang dynasty culture entered a period of slow decline. But the literary tradition of LUSHAN remained alight, like embers that were still smouldering. Half a century after Li Bai's death, another great poet came to LUSHAN. He'd been demoted and sent there as punishment following an assassination in the Tang capital, Chang'an. On the third day of the 6th lunar month in the year 815, Prime Minister Wu Yuanheng was being carried to court as usual in his sedan chair. However, that day he was attacked by robbers and killed. A court official by the name of Bai Zhui immediately submitted a petition to the emperor asking for the criminals responsible to be brought to justice. However, in his haste, he ignored certain formalities. Thus, in the year 816, he was demoted to deputy military governor of Jiangzhou, sometimes known as Jiujiang, a region on the Xunyang River, a tributary of the Yangtze. Bai Zhui was another great poet with political ambitions. In ancient times, the Jiujiang ferry was a marsh covered with reeds and bamboo. One autumn night 1200 years ago, a meeting of two strangers, a poet and a musician, in the moonlight there, gave rise to a beautiful and melancholy song. It was called Song of the Pipa Player, one of the most important poems of the Tang dynasty. In it, the poet laments, "Since we are both vagrants in the wide world, what matters it if we have met before?" These two lines have become an eternal theme for travellers in adversity. Bai Zhui stayed in Jiangzhou for 4 years. Away from the imperial court, he listened to the shifting tide on the river and gazed at the clouds rolling over Mount Lu. The position of deputy military governor was a sinecure post, so Bai Zhui had plenty of time to explore the mountain and observe the world and human life.
在江州的时候，给他的好朋友元稹有一封信，信里面讲到他的志向是，志在兼济，行在独善。他一方面意识到政治的那种风波、那种险恶，对他自己的人生可能是一种巨大的戕害，所以有意的要远离，但是又不可能真真正正的脱离。在山水中，他得到了一种心灵的净化、心灵的启迪。在静观山水的过程中，他选择了 找到了自己未来最合适的一条道。
Baijui's poems became finer and more tranquil. In early summer, as all the flowers fall, the peach blossoms in the mountain temple begin to glow. Everywhere, deep in the valleys and high in the mountains, he found poetic inspiration. Between the 3rd and the 13th centuries, LUSHAN was a sacred mountain for Chinese poets. So important was it that China's entire 5,000-year poetry tradition would be inconceivable without it. The school of principle established itself as the official philosophy, and it would hold sway for over 6 centuries. The school can trace its origins to LUSHAN.